Welcome to the first lecture in Political Science 1513 American Federal Government Online. This week's lecture is going to be entitled Introduction and the Function of Government. But since this is the first lecture for the semester, before we begin, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that everybody is on the same page and that we all know where we should be at this point in time, right? So, to begin with, here is a short list of things that you should have already done before pushing play on this video. And if you haven't done any of the items on this list, my suggestion is for you to stop the video, go do that thing, and then come back and try again, right? So first off, you should begin by surveying the content provided to you under the Start Here link on the left-hand menu of the class's Blackboard homepage, right? So go to that left-hand menu, click Start Here, and what you're going to see is a lot of useful content. For example, you'll find a navigation video that breaks down how you will navigate this course on a day-to-day basis. It's going to tell you things like, how do I figure out what's due today, right? You're also going to want to make sure that you've glanced at least briefly at the University Links folder. Here you'll find a lot of useful information about the university's policy pertaining to things like disabilities and accommodations, so on and so forth, about the resources made available to you as a tuition-paying student. And yes, if you're taking an online course at Southeastern, you yourself are a student and there are certain services available to you, right? So you'll want to take a look at that. You'll find an introduction video, which I do strongly encourage you to watch. It'll give you an opportunity to learn a little bit about who I am, to put a face behind this horribly irritating nasally voice that you're going to become incredibly familiar with before the semester is over. And most importantly, you're going to want to look at the syllabus, right? So the syllabus can be found under the Start Here menu, and that's going to provide you with almost everything you need to succeed in this course, right? Everything you need to know to begin moving through American federal government online. Among other things, it'll tell you about how to contact me if you have any questions or if you're having problems with, say, a grade that you think was input incorrectly. It's going to tell you about the makeup policy. It's going to tell you about late assignment policy, grading policy. It's going to tell you about the format of exams. It's going to provide you with information about what textbook you need. And perhaps most importantly, it's going to provide you with a tentative course schedule. Now, the schedule is tentative, so you're going to want to pay attention to course announcements in case I make any changes. But generally speaking, it's going to break down on a week-by-week basis all of the different expectations that I have for you. So in the syllabus, right, open that Word document, scroll to the bottom, you'll see a schedule, and this schedule is going to tell you every graded assignment's availability and due dates, right? It's going to tell you when all your exams are. It's very important that you're familiar with that content. I do also want to point out that the syllabus is a part of the required reading for this week, which means that there will be questions about classroom policy, about the content of the syllabus in your weekly reading quiz, as well as potentially on your first exam, right? So make sure that you have thoroughly read and reviewed that content and reached out to me with any questions that you might have about the syllabus. You will also find under the Start Here tab a course overview video. This will provide you with some information from the syllabus as well, but more importantly, it's going to tell you about how the class is structured. It's going to tell you about what the 4 broad modules or units of content are for this class, and I'll discuss some of the learning goals detailed in your syllabus in that video as well. So make sure that you've looked at that content, you've read your syllabus, and make sure that you've completed all of the reading required for this week. In addition to the syllabus, you will be required to read pages 1 through 10 from Chapter 1 of your textbook. Again, if you're not sure what your textbook is for this class, go ahead and take a look at the syllabus and make sure that you get that as soon as possible. We do have an electronic textbook, so there shouldn't be any problems acquiring it today, and you need to do so. One point that I will make about the readings that I think will hopefully be pretty useful for you throughout the semester is that each chapter begins with a list of learning objectives, right? And when it comes time to taking notes and excerpting important information from each of the chapters, those learning objectives are a pretty good place to start. Right? So if there's content in a chapter which relates to or pertains to one of the learning objectives listed at the beginning of that chapter, you can bet that there's a pretty good chance that at least one question pertaining to that piece of information will appear either on one of your quizzes or on an exam at some point throughout the semester, right? Incidentally, I'll also begin all of my lectures throughout the semester by breaking down the daily learning objectives for those lectures, and that will also, I hope, help you to structure your note-taking, right? So these are the different things that you should have already done before pushing play on this video. Now, I do want to talk about some of the things that you ought to do while you're watching this video. At the end of the day, the most important thing for you to do as you go through lectures for every week of this class is to take notes. Now, everyone takes notes differently. Again, I've already suggested that you structure your notes around the learning objectives that we're going to discuss shortly. But I'd also suggest paying attention to the way that I've laid information out in the PowerPoints, right? Because what these PowerPoints will essentially do is help you structure the lectures in a way that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, right? So it's going to serve as an organizational framework, which will hopefully help you to organize your information in a way which makes it more easily accessible for your studying purposes, right? So while you watch these videos, make sure that you've taken notes, right? Each week you should have already done the required reading and then started the video, but during the video, take notes. And after the video, right, every week you're going to have an assessment, a discussion post, and a quiz. Now, I won't go into these in any great depth, but if you're not seeing these items under the course folder for this week, that's probably because you've accessed the content too early or too late. Every week you will have between Monday and Wednesday to complete your graded assignments, your assessments, your discussion posts, and your quizzes. So if you don't see that content, look at the calendar. The most likely explanation is that you have opened this video either too early, it's not quite Monday of the first week of class yet, or you have opened it too late, it's already after Wednesday. Otherwise, there's some kind of a technical issue going on, and you should probably open the forum for questions and answers and let me know that that's happening so that I can take care of it for you. Do keep in mind, I will see when you posted that, so if you've missed the due date, try not to be sneaky. Okay, so like I said, there's going to be a separate video set aside for the course overview. There are 4 broad units of content that we're going to cover throughout the course of the semester, and I'm only going to talk about these very briefly here, again, because this is our first lecture. So this week and next week, we're going to be providing an introductory framework, right? We're going to start talking about some of the historical influences and contexts from which our constitutional system of government emerged. This is the most historically oriented component of our lecture throughout today as well as the entire semester. But with that being said, pay close attention to what you learn in these first 2 weeks of lecture, because that information is going to help you make sense of content that I present later on, right? So weeks 1 and 2, that's the introduction. We're going to talk about history and things like that. The next week, beginning week 3 all the way to 6, the next unit is a sort of structural framework in which we talk about the key institutions and structure of the U.S. government, right? So this is going to be federalism, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. What are they? What do they do? Where do they come from? How do they check each other? And so on and so forth, right? Again, I'm being very brief here. If you want to see these things discussed in greater depth, go back to the Start Here tab and make sure you've perused all of the appropriate content. The third unit of our course delves into political thoughts, behaviors, and organization, right? So this is the human component. This is where we start to talk about what our role as citizens are in the democratic process, right? We're going to be focusing on the United States, but generally we'll talk about things like how Americans form political institutions, organizations like parties or interest groups, how we achieve our political goals, how we formulate our political beliefs, opinions, and attitudes, how we choose what types of activities to engage in, as well as, kind of how we feel about the government, right? How we feel about the current state of electoral politics. And then we're going to close up with my favorite part of American government, civil rights and civil liberties. In a sense, I've saved the best for last. This is certainly my favorite part of the course. I think it's the most interesting, and it's also arguably the most important, because we'll start to talk about some of the specific civil rights and liberties that you, as an American citizen, are legally and constitutionally entitled to, right? But again, that's going to be the last 2 weeks of the course. For today, we're going to begin with the very most basic aspects of government, right? So I'll start all of my lectures by reading off a list of learning objectives. And at the end of this video, once you have listened to this lecture and taken notes, you should be able to do each of the following things. You should be able to define and explain the concepts and significance of government, politics, legitimacy, authority, power, and the monopoly on the use of violence. You should be able to discuss the ways in which the government affects you and why it matters. You should identify the 4 main reasons why people accept government and the use of violence to coerce obedience from the people by the government, right? You should be able to explain how scholars distinguish between the government and things like organized crime. And you should be able to do things like discuss the main reasons why governments are coercive, right? So that violence I mentioned before that we tolerate from the government, why is it even necessary? If at the end of this video and at the end of your note-taking process for this lecture, you don't feel confident in your ability to fulfill any of these things, you probably need to go back and rewatch the video. If after having watched it twice and taken notes both times, you're still not certain, hit me up with a question. Look at the syllabus for instructions on how to do so, right? So those are the learning goals. But we are, of course, in an introductory course, right? This is a 1,000 level course. And because this course is introductory, I like to begin as basic as humanly possible, right? To give you all of the building blocks which you can stack together and then begin to use to make sense of more complicated lessons introduced later in the semester. And the very most basic way to begin an introduction to government class is by defining the term government. Now, I know that seems like it's kind of pedantic. It seems pretty obvious what the term government means because we use it on a day-to-day basis. But when it comes to actually articulating and explaining the concept of a government in a coherent way that's going to be useful for you, it takes a little bit more time and attention, right? So let's look at the textbook. The textbook defines the term government as, and I quote, the preeminent institution within a society. Government has the ultimate authority to decide how conflicts will be resolved and how benefits and privileges will be allocated, right? Now, that's accurate. There's nothing inherently incorrect about the way that the textbook has defined this term. But it's a little bit clunky and confusing. So I want to simplify it for our purposes here, right? So, when someone asks you, what is government? The short answer is that government is where politics happens, right? The medium-length answer is that government is the institutional setting within which politics takes place. But now that we've defined the government as the institutional setting of politics, we have a new term to define, right? What is politics? Well, very crudely speaking, you can define politics as the collective process by which we make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. Tying that all together, the government is the institutional setting in which we collectively decide who gets what, when, where, why, and how. There are a few points that I want to clarify in this explanation. First, when I say that government is the institutional setting, what I mean is that you don't have to be physically present at a particular location in order to take place in the governing process, right? So you can think about government as the institutional setting in the same sense that you can think about Southeastern as an institutional setting, right? Southeastern is the institutional setting within which you are currently learning, right? In which you are currently previewing this lecture. You're not probably physically located on Southeastern's campus if you're taking this class online. So it's the institutional setting within which you are undergoing the learning process. But it's not your physical location. Most of you are probably physically located, say, in your living room or your bedroom or your dormitory right now. Well, not your dormitory, that's on campus. But you get the point, right? It's not necessarily a physical place. It's an institutional location, an institutional context or setting. In this case, an institutional setting where politics happens, right? The next point that I want to make is that I have highlighted the term collectively on the slide for a very particular reason. Politics can only take place when we are talking about a group of people, right? So politics is an inherently collective process. If you're stranded on an island and you're trying to decide whether you should eat coconuts or pineapples, your decision-making process is not political. It's not collective. You don't have to communicate with anyone else. That is a strictly psychological decision-making process. But if you're stranded on an island with, say, 3 or 4 other people, and you're trying to decide who gets to eat the coconut and who gets to eat the pineapple, or who gets to eat what portion of the coconut, that becomes a political process because it's collective. You're now going to have to communicate with other people, right? You as a group are deciding who gets what, when, where, why, and how. So the government is the institutional setting in which this takes place for our society, right? The last point that I want to clarify is that in this context, when we say what, we're not just talking about material resources, right? So the what and who gets what, when, where, and why does include things like, say, food, like coconuts or pineapple. It includes things like money or water or healthcare, right? It does encompass material resources, but it is not limited to material resources. It goes above and beyond the material to the immaterial. When we're talking about who gets what, we're talking not just about who gets what portion of a coconut. We're talking about who gets what legal protections, who receives what constitutionally protected rights and liberties under our system of government. We're talking about who gets what types of privileges, benefits, who is given what methods of influence within an organization, within a group, for example. And it's not just benefits and privileges as the textbook might make you think. And those are definitely a very important component of the what and who gets what, when, where, why, and how, but they are not the only components. In addition to material resources, benefits, privileges, and protections, we also determine who receives what responsibilities in the process of politics that takes place within government's institutional setting, right? For example, who is responsible for taking care of your children? Who is responsible for making sure that our nation is defended in a time of crisis? If you've ever registered to vote, well, you're also registered for jury duty, right? That is a responsibility which you as an American citizen take on. Who decided that American citizens would be responsible for serving as juries? Well, the government did, right? Or rather, we, the American people, did so through the process of politics in the institutional setting that the government provided, all right? So, bottom line, government is the institutional setting where politics happens, and politics is the process by which we collectively make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how, right? So now we've got a pretty good idea of what government is, and we can define, right, we can define the term politics. That's part of our learning objectives for today. But once we have gotten to this point, the next question that I think people usually put forward when I'm teaching this class in a physical classroom is, why should I care, right? Why is this something that we have to learn about? Well, in the state of Oklahoma, you have to learn about it because the government says so, right? The state of Oklahoma requires this if you're going to receive a bachelor's degree from one of our accredited institutions. But there are really a number of different reasons why you should care. There are a number of different reasons why the government is worth learning about. The most obvious of these is that you're paying me for a grade, right? So at the end of the day, when you pay tuition, really what you get in return for that money is credit. You get a grade which appears on your transcript, telling future employers or the admissions board at a graduate program that you completed this class and letting them know how well you did during the process of your undergraduate education, right? Now, if you slack off, if you don't pay attention, you don't absorb the information presented by me through these lectures or by the authors of your textbook in their writing, what's going to happen at the end of the day is that you're not going to do very well. You're going to get a bad grade, which really means that you have essentially paid someone to give you a bad grade, to lower your GPA, to make you less competitive, to make your transcript less impressive for future employers, right? And you don't want to waste money. You don't want to pay somebody to give you a bad grade. What you would prefer to do is to take that money you spent and translate it into a good grade that's actually going to help you in the long run, right? So the first reason that you personally should care about the government is that you need to know about it in order to do well in this class and get the biggest bang for your buck, right? Don't waste your money. Don't squander it. And that's one reason to care about the government right now. But more importantly, there are a number of reasons why the government matters in general, why, independent of your performance in this class, it's something that you ought to understand. And the very most obvious, the very most fundamental of these is that the government affects literally every single aspect of your life. And I'm not exaggerating here when I say every single aspect, right? I've got a list of areas that I want you to think about. Eating, drinking, moving, breathing, talking, or just being alive, right? I want you to take a moment, pause the video if you have to, but take a moment and think about at least one way in which the government affects what you eat, what you drink, how you move, right? And I'm going to pause here. When I say move, I don't just mean transporting yourself from one residence to another or moving from one house to an apartment down the street. Yeah, that's part of what is encompassed by the term moving in this context. But let's get a little bit more fundamental than that. Think of one way in which the government affects the way you physically maneuver your body, the way you shift your limbs, the way your chest rises and falls, right? Physically, how does the government affect moving your body on a daily basis, right? Think about how the government affects breathing on a daily basis, talking, speech, the things you say. And think about how it affects your ability just to survive, to live, to exist, right? So let's go through these one by one. Hopefully you've had a moment, you've paused the video if necessary, and you've come up with at least one example of a way in which the government affects you in each of these areas. But in case you haven't, I'll provide a few examples here, right? So let's start with eating, right? Well, the government provides a series of legal regulations which are designed to make sure that the food people sell to you is safe for human consumption. So one way in which the government affects what you eat might be that it makes certain that the food being sold to you at grocery stores or restaurants is actually safe, right? It also requires them to provide information about things like nutrition if we're talking about, say, Walmart or a local grocery store. Same thing can be applied to drinking. But there's more to it than just this. The government also affects what you're able to eat, right? So maybe, for example, some of you wouldn't mind devouring a hash brownie, right? Maybe you want to spend the next 8 or 10 hours passed out on your mother's sofa. I don't know. But you're not allowed to do so. The government says no. So if you're going to try to eat a hash brownie, right, you're going to have to engage in illegal activity. You're going to put yourself at risk of jail time or a steep fine or at the very least a stern talking to by the local police officer, right? So the government affects the quality of the things that you do eat, and it also affects what you're able to eat. Same thing with drinking. If you're not 21, well, generally speaking, you're not going to be able to legally drink alcohol. So if you do choose to ingest alcoholic or intoxicating beverages, you're going to have to do so in secret, or otherwise you will face certain legal consequences for your actions, right? So the government tells you what you can eat and what you can't eat, as well as what you can and cannot drink. And it helps to make sure that when you are consuming a substance, whether it's a beverage or a food item, it's safe, right? The government also affects moving. Again, if we're talking about transporting yourself from one residence to the other, you're probably going to have to use public roads, which are built by the government, funded by the taxpayers, using funds that the government takes from our paychecks and from other sources, right? But more fundamentally, the government tells you how you can use your actual physical person. It spends a lot of time doing things like telling us where we are allowed to physically be located at, right? And the government can physically restrain you. If it feels that you're a danger, the government is allowed to do things like hold you down and handcuff your hands behind your back. In fact, if you've ever been arrested, this has happened to you. If you ever have served a prison sentence, they've done quite a bit to control how you move your body, right? But even outside of criminal activity, right, there are rules about moving your physical person, about shifting your limbs, about maneuvering. You can't go sprinting across a busy freeway, right? Not just because you'll get hit by a car, but because if you do, if you survive, right, you might not, but if you do survive, you might also wind up getting arrested for that. What if I wanted to run through a crowded aisle at the local grocery store, flailing my arms wildly and violently? Well, even if I don't mean to hurt somebody, I'm putting other people in danger, and I'm not allowed to do that. So the government would probably send police officers, again, to arrest me, to physically restrain me. It's telling me, and the laws that it creates and enforces, how I am allowed to move, not just in terms of transporting myself from one location to the next, but in terms of how I employ my physical person, how my limbs are shifting, right? In terms of breathing, I think that the most obvious example of government influence is the EPA, right? It does things like regulate the amount of pollutants that industries are allowed to put into the air that we have to breathe. So on some level, the government helps to ensure that we have clean air, especially if we live in a highly urbanized area, though this is less important if you live in like Durant, Oklahoma, right? But it's not just providing clean air. Again, the government affects what things you are allowed to inhale, right? Just as you're not allowed to eat a hash brownie, you're not allowed to breathe in the vapors of burnt marijuana, right? Not allowed. It's illegal. The government says, no, don't do that. So what we find is that, again, the government is coming between your lips and the rest of your body, right? The government is controlling not just what you eat, drink, or how you move, but really what you breathe. The government also affects talking, communication with other individuals, verbal communication in particular, right? We do have a freedom of speech in the United States. It's under the First Amendment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're allowed to say whatever you want. You can't get on a plane and start shouting, bomb, bomb, bomb. You can't walk into a crowded movie theater and start screaming that there's a fire unless, in fact, there actually is a fire, right? The government says no. It's controlling the things that you speak, the ideas and the thoughts that you articulate, as well as how and where you can articulate them, right? What about just being alive? Can you think of ways that the government affects this? Well, on some level, I would argue that the government allows us to survive, right? It makes life possible for some of us. I, for one, would not survive a day in the Amazonian rainforest. I need the society governed by the government to continue my physical existence. But at the end of the day, the government has a lot of power to decide who lives and who dies. Most obviously, it can do things like, for example, execute criminals. It can do things like launch drone strikes, in some cases against U.S. citizens. In fact, this happened under the presidency of President Barack Obama, quite controversially, right? We had a U.S. citizen who was taken out with a drone bomb without due process of law, and it became something of a controversy for that administration. So the government's deciding who lives and who dies. It has the power to kill you, and in some cases, it's actually authorized, arguably, to exercise that. The government also decides whose life gets protected from other citizens. Who has the right to life? Does the inmate on death row have a right to life? Right? What about fetuses, right? Our country still has a fairly heated debate about whether the government should provide equal protection of the right to life prior to birth. And generally speaking, what the Supreme Court has said at this point in time is that no, we shouldn't do this, that the human fetus does not have a right to life, that mothers should be able to terminate pregnancies if they choose to do so. And in so doing, it has influenced, right, again, who lives and who dies. In this case, whether certain fetuses will ultimately be carried through to birth or terminated prior to that point. So the governments, again, affect who lives and who dies. In fact, throughout history, what we find is that not only our government, but other governments have engaged in massive acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. In the United States, we have the Indian removal, right? And Germany, we have the Holocaust. We've got massacres in places like Russia and China during communist rules. We've got the Rwandan genocide. Governments have carried out mass killings. They have exercised their ability to decide who lives and who dies. The bottom line is that the government does a lot of things to enable us to survive, and it does a lot of things to decide who gets to live and who dies. It affects literally every single aspect of your life on a very, very personal basis every single day. If you are listening to me right now, you're probably paying tuition to Southeastern Oklahoma State University, which is an educational institution run by the state. It's a public, taxpayer-funded institution, and this lesson is therefore brought to you by the government, right? So the government affects you on a very, very intimate day-to-day basis, and if it's going to have this profound impact on your life, well, I think that it makes sense to say that you should probably understand how it works, how it operates, and how you can influence it. One of the major goals that I have for this course is to provide you with the information you need to effectively engage in the democratic process, to effectively act upon the political process here in the United States. If you understand how the government works, you are better able to fulfill your civic duties and to actually go above and beyond the bare minimum of doing things like just voting, right? To actually effectively pursue your political goals. Now, I'm fairly certain that a number of you don't really have a lot of political goals, or rather that you don't really care enough about politics to get involved. But that might change. If you're apathetic, that's okay. You are under no obligation at this point in time to engage in the political process. But at some point in your life, you may decide that you want to, and if that circumstance arises, well, I want to make sure that you have the requisite knowledge necessary to act on the urge, right? So I'm trying to give you an additional option. I'm trying to teach you what you need to know to be an effective political advocate and an informed citizen in the United States if you choose to do so. Again, I'm not telling you that you have to, but if at some point, for example, you become dissatisfied with how crime is being handled in your neighborhood, or how at some point your child's education is being handled, well, engaging the political process is how you affect these things, and I want you to know how to do so. So the last reason I'm going to point out for why this is worth paying attention to is that knowing how the government works, understanding the political process, gives you power. It gives you the option to more effectively influence these things. So that will bring us to our next slide. We know what the government is, we know why we should care about it, and I think that the next logical step is to begin discussing what the government does, right? Well, I'm going to break this down in more detail as we move forward, but for now what I want to say is that the government does things that we don't generally allow other people to do, right? It regulates our health. It tells us what types of health insurance we can or cannot buy. And currently, although this might change in the near future, it actually mandates that we purchase health insurance. It tells us what types of health services we can access and under what circumstances, what regulations, so on and so forth. It redistributes property and wealth through the process of taxation. It controls your spending. It tells you what products you're allowed to buy and what products you aren't allowed to buy and from whom you're allowed to buy them, right? You can't just go and buy liquor from whoever you want. Generally speaking, people who sell liquors require a special government-issued license, though that does vary from state to state. We'll talk about that in week 3 when we begin to discuss federalism, right? The government decides how much of your paycheck you get to keep, right? Here in the United States, we've had an income tax since the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And what that means is that every time you get paid, the government takes a small portion of the money that you've earned, right? The government, broadly speaking, tells us what to do. It decides what's legal and what's illegal. In other words, it's bossing us around, right? And none of this is to attack the government. None of this is to say that the government is inherently good, nor is it to say that the government is inherently bad. Rather, the point here is to illustrate that the government does things which only the government is allowed to do, right? Imagine that somebody else tried to tell you how much of your paycheck you're allowed to keep. In political philosophy, there are a set of 3 relatively well-known hypothetical situations that we use to illustrate this point. I'm not going to go through these in great depth, but I will link in the course folder for this week a text that elaborates upon these 3 famous thought experiments. But let's go ahead and take a look at Principled Pete, right? So for this scenario, I want you to imagine that you've got, let's say, a cousin, and his name is Pete. And Pete, he has a lot of principle. And on principle, he's really, really concerned about how many children are starving and hungry here in the United States. He's very concerned about rampant hunger and poverty. And he recognizes that you have more money than you need. You're not necessarily wealthy. You might be, I don't know. But if you're able to afford tuition, more likely than not, you're not a subsistence farmer, right? So he says, hey, look, Joe Schmo over there has more money than he needs to survive. This kid needs some food. So you go home one day, you check your email, and you receive a message from Principled Peter. And Principled Peter, well, he tells you in this email that he's hacked into your bank account, that he's taken 33% of your income, and he's reappropriated it. Congratulations! Your civic duty is done. You had more money than you need, so I took some of it, and I made sure that there weren't any hungry children living in your neighborhood. What would you do in this situation? Well, this is Oklahoma, so a few of you would probably wind up in prison yourself, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that most of you answered, I would call the cops. That's certainly what I would do. That's certainly what I think most reasonable people would do. But it also creates kind of a puzzle if you take time to think about it, right? Because the police that would come and who would in fact arrest Principled Peter for what he's done to you actually help the government do the same exact thing to other people, right? Remember what I mentioned about the income tax. The government takes a portion of your every paycheck and it redistributes that to needy people, right? It spends it on other programs. And you don't get to decide how much they take from you. Not personally, you don't. And you don't get to decide where the money goes once it's been taken from you. Not personally. So, how is it that we're going to accept this from the government but not from Principled Pete? Why is the government allowed to take a portion of your income for feeding needy children, but Principled Pete is not allowed to do the exact same thing, right? Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to point out 4 broad things that people look for from their government. There are 4 broad goals that we like to achieve, but that are very difficult to do without a government that has the ability to enforce its decision through the use of violence, through the use of police or military action, right? So there are 4 functions that the government fulfills, 4 goals that it helps us achieve in exchange for our obedience, in exchange for our compliance with its laws, rulings, and decisions. The first of these goals, the first thing that we want to achieve, is a set of consistent rules to structure our lives, right? So we want rules that tell us things like how we can interact with other individuals. What can people do to me and what can they not do to me? What can I do to them? What are the social expectations I can have when I leave my house? At the bare minimum, for example, as a citizen of the United States, I can generally expect, right, that you won't physically assault my person. And if you do so, I have a place to turn to make sure that you're held accountable, that it doesn't happen again, right? So we look to the government for rules which tell us how to interact with one another, what to expect from each other, from our peers. And more importantly, we want these rules to be consistent, right? We don't want to have to completely change how people go about their lives on a day-to-day basis. We want these rules to last. We don't want to rewrite the United States Constitution every time a new president is elected, although certain administrations may have liked to do so, right? So we look to the government to provide a set of consistent rules that we can count on as we go through our lives, and as our children go through their lives, and our grandchildren, and so forth. And as you might have gleaned from the first 10 pages of your textbook, in its discussion of institutions, the government provides this, right? It sets rules, it creates laws that structure our lives, and that last above and beyond any one particular administration. Long after everybody currently in Congress has grown old and passed away, many of the laws that they passed are still going to be on the books. They structure our lives. They tell us how to interact with one another, what to expect from each other over time. Right? So that's the first thing that government does for us in exchange for our obedience. The second main reason that people create governments and agree to obey them and agree to let governments use violence to enforce their decisions, right, is that we want a theoretically neutral mediator of disputes, especially when we're dealing with strangers. Now, there are a couple points that I'm going to make here. First, I do want to emphasize the idea of a theoretically neutral mediator, right? Theoretically. In practice, we know that governments are very rarely as neutral as they like to make themselves out. In our country, for example, we have found that in practice, there's a long history of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. So we don't quite reach the ideal of a perfectly fair, unbiased, neutral mediator, but we want to come as close as possible. And the government has so far seemed to be the closest way we can achieve this goal, right? And again, this is especially true when we're dealing with strangers. So if, for example, you get into a fight with your sister or your brother, you can go to mom, and mom will serve as the theoretically neutral mediator, right? If you get into an argument with your friends, if you have a dispute about who should have to pay for today's pizza, or who should have to clean the toilet seat when you're with a roommate, right? Or a spouse, for example, you can usually work that out. You know these people. You're going to have to live with them more or less for the rest of your life. So if you're a complete jerk, it's going to make things more difficult for you too, right? Right. So when it comes to mediating disputes with people we know, our friends, our family, and acquaintances, things are relatively easy. But the United States is a big society, right? And we have to coexist with a lot of people that we don't know and who will pass at certain points in our life and then never see again, right? And how do we mediate disputes with them? If, for example, you got into a fender bender with a complete stranger who you had never met, and he thought that it was your fault, but you thought that it was his fault, how would you go about deciding who had to pay for damages? Well, more likely than not, one of you would contact the authorities, and you might have to go to court to make this decision, right? The courts help us to mediate disputes. The government, theoretically speaking, has no interest in who pays who for the damages in your fender bender. But with that being said, the lack of an interest means that they can give you a theoretically fair ruling, right? They'll decide who actually was at fault without any interest, without a dog in the fight, so to speak. The next thing that we want from the government that it provides to us in exchange for our obedience and our compliance is a series of public services that we can't really provide by ourselves. Now, I say can't on the slide. That's a little bit normatively charged. It's a presumption that a lot of political scientists tend to make. It's not necessarily true. There are some people who would argue that we can get these services, but basically everyone can agree that there are some services provided by the government which would be really, really difficult for us to acquire on our own. The really famous example are roads, are highways going across the country, right? Because everybody uses the roads, but nobody wants to pay for them. This is what we call the free riding issue. And what we find on a societal level is that if one group of people is consistently paying for the roads, but everyone is using them, they eventually get sick of it. They don't think it's fair that they pay all the costs when other people enjoy a share of the benefits. So what they do is they say, you know what, I'm not going to pay so that you can have a free ride. Either you start carrying your fair share or I'm going to quit. And when those other people still refuse to pay the costs, well, the project loses its funding. It doesn't get done. We've probably experienced this ourselves at some point in our educational background. If you've ever gone to high school or in a university class done a group assignment, for example, you probably know that unless there's a professor to hover over your shoulders and make sure everyone's doing their fair share of the work, well, one person's going to do a lot of work, a couple people are going to do a little bit of work, and one person's going to sit back and do absolutely nothing the whole damn time, right? They're going to be on their cell phone, and yet everybody gets the same grade. Well, this free riding issue, again, makes it more difficult for you to get the grade you would like to get. If you're shooting for an A, it's a lot easier when every member of the group is productive and contributes, right? But if you have even one person who just sits back and texts the whole time, your job becomes infinitely more difficult. It would be easier if you could actually force that person to participate, to do their fair share. And that's the function of government in our society. It acts as the teacher who forces each student in a group assignment to do their fair share to make the job easier for everybody as a whole. So governments help us to achieve collective services. They do things like build roads or provide welfare or construct lighthouses. And that's going to pop up when you do your assessment. This is the kind of thing that I want you to think about when you sit down and begin working on assessment 1 for this week's graded assignment, right? The fourth reason, right, that we agree to submit to the government, the fourth thing that we want from the government is to feel safe and protected from force and fraud. Now, when I say force, I'm talking about really two different things. Foreign aggression by military powers in other countries, right? If China invaded the United States, it's the government, through the armed forces, that would ultimately come to our protection. If the British wanted to quarter soldiers in our houses, it's the government that would try to stop them. They would organize our resistance efforts. But I'm also talking about force by our fellow citizens. I'm talking about criminal activity, violence. We don't want people to come in and physically assault us, to rob us, to mug us, so on and so forth, right? The government is there in part to protect us from this kind of activity, right? In addition to protecting us from force, it's also supposed to protect us from fraud, right? So if you agree to pay me $100 to come and wash your car tomorrow, maybe it's a really nice car and I'm really good at giving them, just that perfect level of wax or buffering, right? You agree to pay me $100 and I don't show up, who are you going to turn to? More likely than not, it's the government, right? I'm not allowed to do that. That would be illegal. That would be fraud. The government's job, right, is to protect you from fraud. And in order to do that, it uses violence, right? It uses coercion. It uses police. It takes military action. It will actually physically force me to comply with my contract. And if I don't, well, then I'm physically going to be dragged into a jail cell, right? So the bottom line is that the government does exist and it does seem to fulfill certain functions. And we agree to obey the government, to comply with its laws, its rulings, and its decisions, its determinations, and things like court cases, in order to achieve goals that would be really difficult for us to accomplish on our own or without violence. And I've used that term a lot. Violence, force, coercion. These words are popping up over and over again. But I think that we've run into a sort of question here, right? Because there is no doubt that governments are inherently coercive. They are inherently violent institutions. They do not seem to work very well if they cannot back up their decisions and enforce their rulings with the threat and use of violence. But that's the kicker, right? Because what we just found is that the governments exist to help us achieve goals. So if they're helping us to achieve our goals, if they're providing all these benefits, the roads, the food stamps, and so on and so forth, if they're providing all these services, if they're so beneficial, why are they compulsory? Why do they have to force people to comply with their wishes if their job, if their primary function is to help us achieve our goals? Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to ask a different question. Have you ever seen The Purge? Well, it's a terrible, terrible movie. I hate it. Fight me, sue me, I don't care. It's a terrible, ridiculous movie with a silly premise, and I don't like it. If you disagree, that's fine. But the idea in this movie is that once a year, all laws are suspended. They become basically suggestions. They're voluntary. You don't have to murder somebody if you don't want to, but neither are you prevented from doing so, according to the premise of this movie, right? So what I want you to do is to imagine how you would act in a society where the laws were suggestions, where the government could not use any form of force, violence, or coercion to punish you if you chose to disobey rules. Now, if you've seen the movie, and this is why I hate it, by the way, you might get the idea that literally everybody is a sociopathic serial killer, and that everybody would immediately start slaughtering children. And I don't think that's true, right? I don't think that anyone listening to this lecture right now would, given the opportunity, choose to murder a child, right? If all laws were suspended tomorrow, if they became mere suggestions and not mandates, I highly doubt that any of you would go on a killing spree, or that any of you would start shooting up heroin, right? But I'm willing to bet that a lot of you would probably commit some kind of a property crime, right? A lot of you might trespass. Some of you might steal some things. And, you might use the opportunity to settle some old scores. Maybe you've got a old employer who just treated you like crap, a manager who is extremely rude at your first job. And I suspect some of you might, proverbially crap on that employer's desk. Right? It might happen. That's a colorful example. You might not literally take a poop on somebody's desk, but you get the idea, right? I'm willing to bet that a lot of people would probably use the opportunity to settle some old scores in possibly violent fashions. And that's why the government has to be violent. That's why the government needs to be able to use the threat of violence to enforce its decisions, right? If it did not have the ability to physically punish you, to physically restrain you, or in some cases even to do something as extreme as execute you, well, it would be very difficult for the government to make sure everybody is complying with the rules that we as a society need for peaceful coexistence, that we need to do things like feel safe and secure, right? And it's not just about controlling us, preventing us from breaking the law. It's about getting us to cooperate with collective programs, right? Again, think of that group assignment. The reason that students will spend the entire group assignment texting is because they know that those students who actually care about their grades can't do anything about it. You don't have any authority. If you physically assaulted another student and tried to force them to do their fair share, you were the one who would get in trouble, right? Again, this is the collective action problem. This is what we call free riding. Without the authority to compel compliance and cooperation, the government is not able to do things, right? Is not able to do things like fund the roads and make sure that we're not killing each other, right? So this is why all governments, every single one, are inherently violent. At their core, violence, force, coercion are the key component that allows the government to operate. And again, I think that this can sound really scary, right? Because the way I've discussed the government so far might make it seem as though we're essentially dealing with a really highly organized mafia, right? So how is the government different than organized crime? How is the government distinct from the mafia? Because what we do know is that if you go back and you look at organized crime organizations throughout history and across the globe, they do similar things. We have what we call protection rackets and extortion, right? We've all familiarized ourselves with The Godfather's offer that you can't refuse, right? If you've seen that movie, what you'll find is that you've got this Godfather, this powerful head of an organized crime organization who legitimately provides services that actually seem to be benefiting people. He does favors, right? And in order for him to be able to do these favors, he reserves the right to request that people pay him back. And what happens if you don't pay the Godfather back? Well, he uses violence to punish you, right? We've got protection rackets where mobsters would show up at the stores of shop owners on boardwalks in places like New Jersey, right? And they would say, hey, look, there are a lot of hoodlums running around. But don't worry, pay us $50 a week, pay us a certain fee in a certain period of time, and we'll make sure that nobody messes with you. We'll protect your property. And if you don't pay us this mandatory tax, essentially, this extortion fee, what we're going to do is break your legs. Or we'll smash up your shop. We'll take your property away from you. Again, that seems kind of similar to what the government does, right? So is there a difference? Well, some people would probably say no, but in academics, in the field of political science, we do generally think that there are at least a few distinguishing features which can be used to differentiate between organized crime, like mobsters and the mafia, and governments, right? There do seem to be certain differences. Now, I don't know if these differences are morally significant. I'm not qualified to tell you. That's an opinion that you have to form for yourself, but they do exist. They have been observed by the academic community. So we're going to start to talk about the primary characteristics that help us to distinguish governments from organized crime organizations, right, or institutions. The first key feature, the first big factor used by academics to distinguish governments from organized crime is what we describe as legitimacy. Now, your textbook provides a sort of inside-the-box definition of legitimacy, but basically when we call a government legitimate, what it means is that there is a popular acceptance of the government's right to exercise authority. The government is entitled, it has a right to do things like create laws, to tell you what to do, and to punish you if you disobey it. Now, where this right comes from depends on who you ask. In democracies, we tend to believe that the right to exercise authority comes from the consent of the governed, right? Comes from the voice of the people through the electoral process. But one way or the other, governments tend to be more legitimate. In a given society, the government tends to have more popular acceptance of its right to exercise authority than any other group or organization. And this is true even outside of democracies. It's not always the case, but as a general rule, governments have more legitimacy than any other actors in their society. Governments also have authority, right? It's not enough to have people recognize your right to exercise authority. You need the authority itself. And when I say authority, what I mean is the government's power to enforce its decision on us or to compel obedience within a certain area. Sometimes this is also called jurisdiction, right? Governments have the authority to control certain forms of activity. Now, not all governments have authority over all aspects of life. In fact, when you start talking about governments that exercise authority, that claim authority over everybody's lives, over every aspect of those lives, well, we're starting to talk about authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. And again, you can look at your textbook if you want to break that down further. But even in the United States, even in liberal Western democracies, governments have some level of authority. We tend to recognize that the government does have the authority to level taxes, right? To levy taxes. The government does have the authority to tell us about when we can physically accost somebody and when we can't. generally speaking, our government exercises this authority to tell us that you're only allowed to physically accost somebody when doing so is necessary for self-defense, right? So governments have legitimacy, right? Popular acceptance of their authority. They have authority, the ability to enforce their decisions, and they have power, right? Now I'm going to define power as the ability to make somebody do something that they otherwise wouldn't. Power is not necessarily coercive or violent in its fundamental nature, right? You can persuade somebody to do something that they otherwise wouldn't. If you're really persuasive, well, then you have power. You have influence over other agents, other actors, other people, right? But what we find is that, generally speaking, governments have more power than anyone else. They are not the only ones that have power, but at the end of the day, if the mafia goes to war with the United States government, who's going to win? The one with tanks and jets and nuclear weapons and drones and police forces and armored vehicles, right? The government has more power than anyone else. It's the strongest actor in our society. And by virtue of that power, it's able to do things and to enforce its decisions to a greater extent than anyone else, right? So governments have legitimacy, authority, and power. And all of this can sort of be boiled down to the central theme, the most important thing that I want you to take away from this portion of the lecture. The primary factor used by academics to distinguish between governments and organized crime is what we describe as a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. A monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, right? Now, this is also sometimes called the legitimate use of coercion, the legitimate use of force. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the government has a widespread recognition of its right to use physical force, coercion, or violence to make people obey, right? So if, for example, I felt that you deserved to be punished, I do not have the right to use violence or force to punish you, right? The government does. If you slapped me and 2 weeks later I decided that I wanted to punish you and I waited outside your house and then I attacked you, I would probably wind up in jail. But if instead I turned to the government and they sent police over, well, those police could definitely use force, violence even if necessary, to accost you, to arrest you, to put you on trial, and to potentially charge you with assault, right? If I tried to lock you up for doing something I didn't like, well, that would probably be considered a breach of etiquette, right? It's not okay for me to do it. But generally speaking, we do recognize that it is okay for the government to do these things. So the number one thing, the biggest factor, the most important distinguishing feature used to differentiate governments from organized crime is a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And that more or less summarizes the key points that I want to address for today's lecture. All right? Now that we've finished our lecture, I'm going to give you a closing statement about how you should move forward. Again, I'm only doing this today because it's our first lecture. But having completed this lecture and assuming that you've reviewed the Start Here content, the syllabus, so on and so forth, the next thing that you need to do is to go and make a post on the discussion board, right? I want you to create a thread introducing yourself. Under the Week 1 coursework folder, you'll see a link to the appropriate discussion board forum with instructions about what information I want you to provide in this post, right? Basically, you'll introduce yourself, you'll tell me a little bit about yourself, and then you'll go and you'll respond to somebody else's introduction. Hopefully, this will help to create a certain level of interaction between students so that you don't feel entirely isolated, right? So that we can get to know each other and maybe make some connections. Next, you need to complete Assessment 1. This is going to be a Word document. You're going to access it under Course 1, beginning on Monday, right? Make sure that you have this turned in by Wednesday. You'll print it off. You'll complete it in Word, and then you're going to send that to me using the instructions attached to the document, right? The next thing you need to do is complete the quiz. Again, this will be available starting on Monday, August 21st, 2017. You'll have until Wednesday, August 21st, 2017. and it's pretty straightforward. They're going to be fill in the blank, multiple choice, and multiple answer questions. There'll be 10 of them. You'll have approximately 1 minute per question. Answer each one of them to the best of your ability. All 3 of these things are graded. Make sure that you have them completed by Wednesday. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on the message board, or you can send me an email. Look at the syllabus. Make sure that you've completed everything for this course by Wednesday.